This is part 3 of the lecture notes for chapter 23 on the kingdom Plantae. We have come to our section on the seed plants, and the seed plants are grouped into two phyla, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So a little bit about seeds. The seeds contain a sporophyte embryo and stored food within a protective seed coat. So basically that's the three parts of a seed. Is there's a protective coat on the outer portion of it, then there's stored food in there, and then the embryo, the plant embryo, which kind of, if you open up a seed, you can see the embryo looks kind of like a little leaf or leaves. Seeds allow plants to survive long periods of dormancy. If you think about, dried beans that we buy in the grocery store and how long they were probably there, and then all we have to do is add water and they'll germinate, and we can, of course, cook them and eat them, but if we add water, they'll start growing sprouts. So seeds can survive long dormant periods. Seed plants are, by nature, they are heterosporous. That means they have microspores and megaspores within them. They have both the male and the female structures within them. The male gametophytes in seed plants are pollen grains, and the pollen grain contains the sperm. So the actual male gametophyte is simply a pollen grain. It's not a plant. It's not a plant structure like what we've seen with our previous groups of plants. The male gametophyte is the pollen grain itself. Now, we know fertilization is when the sperm reaches the egg, unites with the egg, but pollination occurs when the pollen grain attaches to the female gametophyte and unites with it. So pollination occurs when either wind or a pollinator, such as a bee or a bird or an animal, carries the pollen to the female gametophyte. And the female gametophyte is found within the ovule. Is found within the ovule of the flower. Well, it would be the flower if it was a flowering plant, but it's within the ovule. The structure is called the ovule. So the ovule contains the female gametophyte, and when the ovule is fertilized, or when the pollen tube reaches the ovule and the sperm actually meets the egg, then that's when fertilization occurs. Since this occurs there's no flagella on the sperm or anything like that, so no water is needed. This prevents the need for the plant to grow in a wet environment. The two groups of seed plants are gymnosperms and angiosperms, and gymno means naked, sperm means seed, so the gymnosperms produce seeds that are not enclosed by a fruit. That's what is meant by naked seed. Mostly the plants within the phylum Gymnosperm produce cones. They don't all, but most of them do. The angiosperms, angiosperm means covered seed. The angiosperms are the flowering plants, so this time you have a seed enclosed by a fruit and a flower. So angiosperms produce a fruit and a flower, whereas gymnosperms do not. The fruit, by the way, is a ripened ovary. So when you bite into an apple, that's what you're eating, the ripened ovary of the apple tree. All right, we're going to talk about the phylum Gymnosperm first. So the gymnosperm group, gymnosperm means naked seeds, and these are the groups of the gymnosperms. They are the conifers, like your evergreen trees. They definitely produce cones. Your pine trees, your evergreen trees, your Christmas trees, these are the conifers. They're the most plentiful, most easily recognizable. The cycads, ginkgos, and gnetophytes are the other three groups. So conifers always produce cones. That's where their name comes from. They also produce tough needle-like leaves, which help conserve water. These needle-like leaves have a thick cuticle and recessed stomata. The dominant stage is the sporophyte generation, of course, because the sporophyte generation is not dominant in all the plant groups except the bryophytes. The pollen grains are wind-blown, and the dispersal stage is the seed. Now, you do need to know this term, monoecious. A plant is monoecious when it produces both pollen and seed cones. And if you ever look at a pine tree at different times of year, the seed cone is easy to recognize because that's what we call the pine cone. But the pollen cones, the male cones, are smaller and they grow in clusters. They look like this. A lot of us are allergic to the pollen that is produced by the pine tree, the pollen cones of the pine tree. But you'll see these growing on different portions of the branches. The seed cones, again, and they can be folded up too before they open up. You know, they look more like scales, but they're wooden. You know, they're made of a tissue that looks like wood, and the pollen cones are they're yellowish in color, and also they're not as tough. The tissue that forms the pollen cones, they're not as tough. Here's some examples of conifers. The pine tree, of course, the tree, the North Carolina tree is the loblolly pine. The state tree. It's not the dogwood. The dogwood is the state flower. A lot of people get that mixed up. This is a spruce pine, which is often used as a Christmas tree. And then we have the juniper. The life cycle of the pine is just basically that it produces female cones. This is a female cones before they're ready to open up. They kind of look like this. And then the male cones just look totally different. They're softer and lighter in color. They don't have that hard woody tissue. So the female cone produces the ovule. The pollen is produced by the pollen cones, and the pollen is blown by the wind. It connects with the ovule, and then a pollen tube grows. And that pollen tube contains the sperm. So uses of conifers, there's many, many uses. My husband and I have been watching the show Alone. We just started kind of binge watching it right now. And we saw this one episode in season 4 where this guy ate pine bark. He shaved it off and he ate it and got very, very sick. But it is edible. It's actually edible. You're not supposed to eat a whole bunch of it, but you can eat it. It has a lot of fructose in it, which is sugar. So I just thought about that because I couldn't believe that he was eating it. But I guess when you're trying to survive, you will do things like that. Anyway, so for uses of conifers, pines are known for their beauty and pleasant smell, of course. The needles of pine trees and the bark are rich sources of vitamins A and C. They can be used to create teas. You can make tea with the needles and the bark and ease symptoms of a cold or a cough. I've never tried that myself, but I have had pine nuts for use in cooking because you can make, what is that stuff called? Pesto. There's a type of pesto that you can make with pine nuts. And then pine oil is used to scent household and personal care products. And it didn't even say here, but the wood, the wood of the pine tree is also used. Okay, so cycads are our second group of gymnosperm. They do produce cones. The cones can be very, very large. Their pollen and seed cones are on separate plants, not on the same plant. They are pollinated by insects, and the sperm have to swim to reach the egg. So even though the sperm is within the pollen grain, the sperm still has to swim to reach the egg. And this is an example of a cycad. Almost looks like a palm tree. It has that kind of look to it, but it's not. And this is the very large cone in the center. This one grows in Africa. Ginkgos only have one surviving species. It's called the Ginkgo biloba plant. It is dioecious, which means that some trees produce seeds and others produce pollen. So some trees are female and others are male. And this is what the ginkgo plant looks like. It has a berry, grows in China, and this is what the leaves look like of it. And then netophytes, it just says they have similarly structured xylem. None have archegonia, the female structure. They do have strobili instead of cones. Strobili are similar to cones, but they're not cones. And a netophyte plant called the ephedra plant is used to produce ephedrine, which is a medicine, has effects similar to caffeine. And then there's a plant called the Welwitschia plant. You heard, I'll say it one more time. It's called the Welwitschia plant. And it only has 2 leaves, and it can grow. It can live like this really, really long time. I want to say thousands of years. This is an example of a netophyte called an ephedra. That's the ephedra plant. And this is a Welwitschia. Very, very old plants. And the plant has 2 strap-like leaves. What you're looking at is the leaves kind of folded all around. So it looks like there are more. I'm going to look up how long they can live. Give me just a second. Okay, so that's what I thought. Anywhere from 400 to 1,500 years, and some plants that are alive today are thought to be even 2,000 years old. So that's just incredible. So those are our examples of netophytes, and just remember, let's go back and review the, here we go. The gymnosperms include the conifers, cycads, ginkgos, and netophytes. And now we will move on to the angiosperms, which are our flowering plants. Most plants on the planet right now are angiosperms. All fruits, vegetables, nuts, herbs, and grains, which are the staples of our diet, are angiosperms. Now, angiosperms are divided into 2 groups. They're divided into the monocots and the eudicots. The monocots include corn, tulips, pineapples, and sugarcane. The eudicots include cactus, strawberry, dandelion, poplars, and beans. Cot, in the word monocot and eudicot, cot stands for cotyledon, and the cotyledon is the seed leaf within the seed. Basically, the seed leaf is the embryo portion of the seed. So a monocot has 1 seed leaf or 1 cotyledon, and a eudicot has 2. This table is really helpful for distinguishing which plants are monocots and which are eudicots. So just knowing that a monocot has 1 cotyledon and a eudicot has 2, it may not be that helpful, but if you think about your seeds, like corn is a seed, right? Corn is a single kernel, so it's a monocot. But a lima bean or any of your beans, you know how they can divide in half, a kidney bean, any of those beans, and of course some of us call lima beans butter beans, but they can be split into 2 halves. Those are eudicot plants or eudicot seeds. And those 2 halves are the portions that contain the 2 cotyledons. So also you can look at a monocot and you can see the flower parts, like the petals, are in 3s or multiples of 3, whereas the eudicots, the flower petals would be in 4s or 5s or multiples of 4 or 5. The pollen grain in a monocot has 1 pore, in a eudicot it has 3. Monocots are usually herbaceous, whereas eudicots can be woody, like a tree or a shrub, or they can be herbaceous. And usually the veins in monocots are parallel to each other, whereas eudicots have a net venation pattern. The stem, if you slice it in cross section, the vascular bundles are scattered, they are arranged into a ring in the eudicots. In a monocot, they're scattered. In eudicots, they're in a ring. And for the roots, the monocots have a fibrous root system, whereas eudicots have a taproot system. So here you can see a monocot flower versus a eudicot flower.